In early February, as part of its America 250 campaign, the Trump White House issued a presidential pronouncement commemorating what it called our victory in the Mexican American War, a war that it framed as being a defensive one forced upon an innocent United States. While many recognize this pronouncement as a reversal of reality, standard history books continue to frame the Mexican American and most other U.S. wars not too differently, and to suggest that U.S. leaders were motivated by good intentions, even if some of the consequences of the wars that they waged proved to be disagreeable. Domestic Causes of American Wars. Ivan Eland's book, Domestic Causes of American Wars, Economic and Political Triggers, is significant in puncturing the dominant nationalistic narrative surrounding American wars. Eland shows that almost all wars in American history resulted from domestic pressures and were initiated in an attempt to achieve hidden strategic motives or crass economic gain. The latter is true, according to Eland, even for the supposed good wars in U.S. history, such as the Civil War and World War II, which are presented in most U.S. history texts as being noble. Eland starts out with a discussion of the quasi-war with France from 1798 to 1800, which American history textbooks conventionally claim was initiated after France started attacking American commercial ships. In reality, Eland emphasizes that merchant greed had caused the U.S. to renege on commercial treaties with France and to allow British ships that attacked French ships to operate out of its ports. Fought entirely at sea, President John Adams and his Federalist Party used the quasi-war to increase their power at home by raising a provisional standing army, creating the Navy Department, and by passing the Alien and Sedition Acts that were used to prosecute Republican newspaper editors and other war opponents for sedition. In 1801, shortly after taking office, Thomas Jefferson sent U.S. warships to the Barbary Coast off Africa without notifying Congress. Subsequently, he declared war on a collection of pirates supported by the Tripoli government after an aggressive U.S. ship captain started firing on Tripoli's ships. The war was framed as a great humanitarian undertaking to rid Libya of an oppressive ruler, a 19th century version of humanitarian intervention, though the coup plot against Yusuf Pasha failed after U.S. naval forces bombarded Tripoli and Derna. Shocked by the brutality of his military counterparts, one U.S. naval officer wrote that they seemed to talk of butchering and cutting up a Turk with as much indifference as one is accustomed to carve a turkey or chicken. Tripoli was then part of the Turkish-run Ottoman Empire. The same thing could have been said about U.S. troops in the Indian Wars or others in the 20th and 21st century if the term Turk were replaced with the main U.S. adversaries in those wars. The most unpopular war the country has ever waged. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morison, the War of 1812 was the most unpopular war that the country has ever waged, not even excepting the Vietnam conflict. Framed as a second war for independence, the Madison administration framed the war as necessary to defend the country from British attacks on U.S. ships on the high seas. The British responded with a counterattack that culminated with the burning of the White House. Traditional historical accounts echo the Madison administration's propaganda and emphasize Britain's violation of U.S. neutrality rights at sea during its conflict with France and its impressment of U.S. sailors. Eland points out, however, that in the years before the outbreak of the war, French warships and privateers seized more American ships than did the British Navy. British seaborne mischief toward Americans was further declining before the war broke out, with the most serious clash between U.S. and British ships having occurred in 1807. The years 1811 and 1812 saw no major incidents, and Britain had ordered its warships not to antagonize American commerce and withdrew much of its navy from the U.S. in an attempt to avert conflict. President James Madison, in his war message to Congress, had additionally alleged British incitement of Indian attacks against U.S. settlers, though Madison provided little actual evidence of this. The Madison administration, meanwhile, used the cover of the war to recruit a mercenary army of American patriots in Florida who were promised land if they rebelled against Spanish authority. When the Seminoles joined the war on the Spanish side, the U.S. military initiated guerrilla warfare techniques to combat them, resulting in the destruction of Seminole homes and cattle. Hostilities were renewed in mid-1816 when an American force attacked Negro Fort at Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River in the Florida Panhandle, where free blacks and runaway slaves had established themselves at the end of the War of 1812. The following year, General Andrew Jackson led a force of 3,000 men against the Seminoles, burning towns, destroying crops, and killing livestock. The Spanish government, convinced that it could not protect its colony, ceded Florida to the United States in the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, which the U.S. ratified in 1821. The Mexican War. Ulysses S. Grant called the Mexican War one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation, an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. Only 10 months after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ending hostilities, miners struck gold in California, which turned out to have a notable share of the world's richest mines. To justify the war, Americans claimed that the Polk administration paid Mexico more than $15 million for more than half of Mexico. However, Polk had really used force after Mexico turned down an offer to purchase its territory. Zealously expansionist, Polk believed in the religious-infused doctrine of manifest destiny and fed off popular support for the war based on the economic benefits that it would bring. In 1844, Polk sent U.S. Commodore Robert Stockton to Texas to get Texas President Anson Jones to initiate covert activities against Mexico, with the aim of provoking Mexico into an attack that would provide a pretext for a U.S. invasion of Mexico. The U.S. Secretary of the Navy at this time supplied the Texas Navy with gunpowder and supplies. Polk, in turn, sent General Zachary Taylor and U.S. troops to Texas in anticipation of a Mexican attack, which was deliberately provoked. The next year, as a further provocation, Polk moved Taylor's men into disputed territory between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. Mexico responded by declaring that it was in a defensive war with the U.S. Taylor's forces added fuel to the fire by taunting and provoking Mexican troops. At the same time, John C. Fremont, a U.S. Army officer, took control of a white settler rebellion against Mexico and its Indian allies in California, which was another provocation. Additionally, the U.S. Army blockaded the port of Matamoros on the Rio Grande River to try to starve 6,000 Mexican troops there. When Mexico responded by firing at U.S. troops, Polk sent a war bill to Congress in May 1846, claiming that Mexico had U.S. territory, essentially forcing Congress's hand. The Civil War Eland considers the Civil War, which cost at least 750,000 lives, to be another avoidable war. He points out that slavery ended peacefully in most other countries and contends that it would have been far less costly in terms of human misery and money if the federal government had adopted a policy of gradual or compensated emancipation to end slavery rather than going to war. According to Eland, Abraham Lincoln, though deified as the greatest American president, behaved uncompromisingly toward the Confederate States and helped provoke the Confederate attack at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which triggered his invasion of the South. Lincoln knew that, by sending a military supply ship to Fort Sumter, it would engender a Confederate response, since it was surrounded by South Carolina artillerymen, and this was only one of 2 forts in the South the Confederates did not control. Lincoln later confided to his friend, Orville Browning, the plan succeeded. They attacked Sumter, it fell, and this did more service than it otherwise would. After South Carolinian forces surrendered at Fort Sumter, Lincoln escalated to a full-blown invasion of the South that adopted scorched earth tactics which violated international laws of war. Eland notes that Lincoln even intervened in the court-martial of a colonel convicted of atrocities and promoted him to brigadier general. According to Eland, the Confederacy could have been defeated in 6 months, though Lincoln's mismanagement of the war ensured that it took 4 years.